It's 10:01 a.m. and I call the January 7th meeting of the Texas Space Commission Board of Directors to order. Before we begin, I'd ask everyone in attendance to please put your devices on silent. If you haven't done that already, just a friendly reminder there. Norm, would you like to call the roll?
Sure, yes, ma'am. Dr. Nancy Curry Bragg. Sassy Doubleby.
Here.
Chair Griffin,
Here.
Evan Loomis, Vice Chair Kathy Leaders,
Here.
Brad Morrison. Here. John Shannon, Secretary Kirk Shireman,
Here.
Dr. Heather Wilson.
And it's my understanding that Dr. Wilson and will be joining late slightly, and Evan Loomis has had a family emergency. So be joining.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. All right, so first, I'd like to consider approval for the board, approval of the minutes from October 7th meeting of the board. Draft minutes have been provided in your board book. So the question is whether those minutes accurately reflect the meeting that we had, or does anyone have any edits or modifications? I have a motion to approve the minutes from our October 7th meeting.
So moved.
Thank you, Brad. Didn't hear that. I heard something. Okay. And may I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Kurt. And for all in favor of approving the October 7th meeting minutes, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? And any abstentions? Okay, the minutes from the October 7th meeting are approved as amended. Thank you so much. So with that, we do need to acknowledge gifts, and as required by Chapter 575 of the Texas Government Code, we must acknowledge those gifts and donations with a value of at least 500 that are given to the commission. There's one gift over 500 to acknowledge, and the details can be found for the board on tab 2 of your board book. And for the public, this item is posted on our website in the documents section of the meeting notice for this meeting. The donation was for registration for staff member Blake Calvert to attend the Texas Economic Development Council's 2024 annual conference, at which he was a panelist to provide an overview on the Texas Space Commission. The board, any questions or discussions on this matter to give to the commission? Hearing none, I have a motion to acknowledge the donation as required by the Texas Government Code.
So moved.
Thank you, Sassy. And may I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Brad. So all in favor, say aye.
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 Saw your mouth, Kirk. So any opposed?
Yeah, sorry, I'm slow on the mute button. I'll get there.
Any opposed? And any abstentions? Okay, the motion carries and the donation is acknowledged. So with that, the real purpose of today's meeting, and thank you all for being here, and those that came in really to be in the audience with us. Purpose of today's meeting, I'll call it kind of more of a work session, if you will, is to discuss several topics of the commission's operations, including contracting and procurement procedures, processes, and training. And I'd like to discuss several items regarding the administration of the SURF grant program, or the Space Exploration Aeronautics Research Fund. So in this discussion, I know that several of us have been anxious to come together in an open meeting so that we can talk for the first time as a full board and staff about some of these items. So, so thank you all for making time. And just by note, as I was preparing for today, you know, as appointees and overseers of public funds, you know, we're all aware of the importance of the transparency in all that we do, and that we want to ensure the legislative and executive branches, our stakeholders, and the public are aware of our operations and decision making. Hence the desire to have today's meeting. For the public, please note that no action will be taken today on grant applications. Today's discussion is for the board and staff to discuss our near-term path forward. we planned again to meet in the next few weeks. We'll talk about the meeting schedule a bit later in the meeting. With the intent of moving forward on some of the SURF grants as defined by statute. And as always, those meetings will be posted in advance as required. So board members, before we get into the topics for discussion, are there any other questions before we dig into what I'll call our workshop for today? Hearing none. And Andres, would you let us know, because I may not be looking at the screen up there, when we have John and Dr. Wilson and
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much. So based on, as many of you know, and for the board, we have our 3 ad hoc work groups to ensure that we are practicing proper governance. And over the past week, several themes have been raised through feedback from staff to me. And I know we've talked about a few of these things in my ad hoc work group that I definitely know I want to hit on today, but I'm sure there may be some others from directors. So I'd like to start. I thought it would be a good starting spot to ask 2 questions in the beginning here, and they're for you, Erin, as our Chief Compliance Officer, which is a critical component to what we're doing with the SURF grants. Could you let us know, just in summarizing, how many grant applications have been received, and how many are considered administratively complete for compliance purposes by staff? And then secondly, how many of those have been uploaded to the dashboard that we have set up for each of us, for review and evaluation by the board members that are selected with any of those? So can we start there? I thought that might be a good set the stage.
Yeah, so through December 15th, we received 219 application submittals. Of those 219, 84 have been deemed administratively complete, and 58 of those 84 are with individual non-completed board members for evaluation. So there's 26 additional applications that are administratively complete that are still with Space Commission staff for review. Before board evaluation.
Okay, and those continue to be worked on a
Yes.
daily basis.
Yeah, we're doing by date I received. Going in order.
So as they come in, we hit those. Very good. Questions from the board? Other thoughts? It might be worth,
Kirk has something.
I'm sorry, Gwen, I got out of phase with the mute button now. So now I'm too fast on the button. Let's see, so you said 219, 84 are administratively complete, which that's, 116 and 19 is 130, 44 left. What's the remainder? Where is the remainder, and when do we expect? Was the remainder all thrown out because they weren't complete, or they were just chewing through those, or what's going on with the remainder?
let me start with that. I believe those are the instituted hires.
Well, some are and some are not. Okay, I can quickly just
Okay,
go
good.
through. First of all, very impressed with your on-the-fly math. That's, you're an engineer, I'm not. So 135 applications have not been deemed administratively complete. Of those, 107 are from institutions of higher education. And the Space Commission, on behalf of the board, is exploring the potential for an external service to provide assessment on those higher ed applications. So that's why those 107 are not administratively complete. The other 28 are either staff has reached out to the applicant, and we're waiting on the applicant to provide additional information or documentation to be able to declare that the application administratively complete. Staff is in discussions with some applicants, kind of going back and forth, making sure we have the documentation or information we need. And then there are some applicants that we still need to complete the initial review of their application and then see if we need to go back to them for more information or documentation. So that's for those 28 other applications that are not from institutions of higher education, where they're at in the process. Oh, and I guess you asked when, and hopefully, I mean, as soon as possible. We're trying to get back to applicants and do the back and forth as quickly as we can. they've been pretty responsive in giving us information. But
Those are just things that were required in the form that had not.
yeah, and we have the grant rules for the agency came out, and those kind of specify some things we need in the process for us to go back to applicants and what applicants need to provide us and how. And so it's all being done in accordance with our rules and statutes.
And have we considered like a deadline? Are we looking at like having a deadline for the initial pieces or for different parts, categories of the applications or not?
I'd love to hop to that topic that came up in
Okay.
groups. And Brad, I'm gonna, as the, a member of the, I have to think of the name, the grant process subcommittee, if you could talk a little bit about what your subcommittee discussed in terms of date. And that is something I would like to discuss as the board here this morning. So you start.
And maybe Gwen, before we jump to that, just to characterize, because it'd be nice to have like the full dimension. Like, can we talk about the total dollar amount? Because we've gotten obviously a considerable number of applicants. And we understand we have this $150 million to look at, but it'd be interesting to hear just the total number of value that's represented with the requests.
We've received 2.96 billion in requested funds.
Okay.
So I would say, as we've talked before, the demand signal is very high.
Yeah. Okay.
So, thank you, Madam Chair, Gwen. And so we've had a good portion of discussing as an ad hoc working committee as it relates to the grant application process. And given the strong demand signal, we do think it would be wise to set an initial deadline for this initial group of applicants. That's not to say that these applicants that have presented to the commission wouldn't be eligible for a subsequent kind of fund round, but rather it allows the board to basically review what has been in hand at a certain point in time. And so, we've discussed in the group allowing and accommodating those applicants that have yet to pitch to the commission, maybe a little bit leeway in January here, but probably set a date to allow us some time to review this initial round of applicants sometime in January for a deadline of this sort. So I'd open it up for conversation and discussion, but we could set it a week from today, 2 weeks from today, or maybe even month end. But I think it does seem necessary for us to get through the review process and to allow us to move forward in this process for selection for an initial round of applicants to set an initial deadline.
Thanks, Brad. Thoughts from the board?
It definitely seems to me that if we got 3 billion of demand on the initial 150 million, until we get a better sense of further funding for the commission, we have a lot to consider just within the initial 150 million, right? So continuing to collect applicants against this first round, I think, just personally, I think we should be thinking about putting a deadline, understanding what we should be assessing against 150 million until we get a better sense of continued funding on the commission. It's just my thoughts.
I completely agree with Kathy. I think we need to go ahead and close it up, set a date to close it.
Brad, you mentioned a couple weeks, end of January, for council. Is there any requirement that we need to consider as we set a date?
Not a hard legal
the primary thing to consider is whether people have a fair opportunity, make sure everybody has the same opportunity. My understanding is this was September 15th is when the
September
grants open.
13th, I believe, is
open.
when the form opens.
Okay, so if then it'll be 5 months,
Yeah.
5 full months as of next Monday, I guess. Maybe a little lead time after that, just as long as the public or the potential grantees have had a fair opportunity to send and submit an application. Well,
Okay.
So if, we were to say January 21st, which would be, more or less 2 weeks, 2 weekends to allow for any respondents to continue to work on their grant application, not knowing that we were thinking along these lines, I think that would be fair. Any conversation around that?
Kirk, I see you've got a hand up.
Yeah, I just, Joseph kind of hit on it. One is, I think if we don't set a deadline, we kind of can't treat the ones that come in at the last minute fairly, right? I mean, they won't have the same consideration. So setting a deadline seems like the best approach. Whatever the deadline, we probably ought to give a little runway to let people know. But the other thing I think I would suggest we consider is being very overt in what we do with in the first round, there'll be N number of awards, so there'll be N minus whatever the number was, 219 minus N remaining. The question would be, what do those go? I think we ought to be clear on whether those go into the next round or they need to be resubmitted. So when we set the deadline, I think we ought to be clear on what we do with those applications to avoid confusion. That was my recommendation.
So I'm clear, did they come in after whatever deadline?
Or that, have already come in, but might not make it through the selection. Is that what you're getting at, Kirk? Would they be eligible to continue to roll forward? Let's say we get another round of monies, for grants in a second tranche. Is that what you're referring to, Kirk?
Yeah, so I'll say it very abstractly. Let's say we had, let me make the number 30 because it's easier to do the math. So 10 we're going to approve, 10 we would have approved, but we ran out of money, and 10 we probably would never approve. So the question I think we ought to address is, we're going to approve, we approve, in my example, 10. Now we have 20 sitting over here. Do we tell people we're going to roll all 20 into the next round, or do we say, nope, everybody's got to resubmit? What do we do? But I think we ought to provide some guidance. That's all. There probably are some that we probably would never approve, but I don't know if we want to I don't know if we want to take that challenge on at this point in time. I'd recommend we just approve some number, and then we either allow them to roll over into the next round, or we tell everybody they have to resubmit. One of those two. My personal preference would be allow them to roll over, but I think it's up for debate. There's probably pros and cons.
Let me see if I can articulate this, and I'm going to turn it over to Norman to do a better job than I might. So with the demand, I don't believe they're not those that aren't awarded in our upcoming meetings, because we may have 2 or 3 or more meetings where we're awarding grants, right? Because we have the 150 million now, and that's what we have to work with. We don't know what will happen in this upcoming session. So right now we have the 150 million, and it may be, and we can talk about that a little bit more today, that we're going to have, in fact, we've looked at some upcoming meetings that I'll hit on as we wrap the meeting today, so that we can have multiple, it gives us some time to get through more of the applications from the compliance side, so that we can look at those that are still in compliance, I guess I would say. So looking at our calendars, this is not very articulate, my apologies, but we've got the 150 million right now. We don't know what we'll have in the future. I don't believe anything that comes out of compliance into those of us that are not conflicted into our database. My understanding, unless we decide otherwise, they don't have to resubmit. So Norman, I'm going to have you pick up the thread from there, because it's not like they're
Removed from consideration for subsequent rounds.
it's just, that's
Yeah.
right.
Right, so, through the process that the subcommittees and the work groups have had in the conversation, as they come in and as they're, sent for evaluation, their, scores are completed. And then moving forward, as we have the next round of meetings set, at that time, they can be considered. And so if we set a deadline currently, all of those subsequent meeting dates that we have, soft targets for would be after, the proposed date that Brad mentioned. And therefore, as quickly as we're able to work through the compliance process to make sure that they are complete and that they're then uploaded to the dashboard and then they're evaluated, it would be that ongoing rolling review process, the opportunity for consideration by the board.
But maybe I'm wrong, but I was hearing Kirk's question a little bit differently. Are we going to have like a round one? And after we make awards, I think what I was hearing, and Kirk, you can correct me if I'm wrong, what I was hearing is that we were like to let the people that weren't selected have a better understanding of, are they still in the selection process or are they somehow shut down for round one? Like, I do feel like having people have some kind of understanding of where they are in the process is very helpful, right? Because if we do another round of reviews, it would be good for the grant requesters to know where they are in the process. Are we gonna have a 2024, 2025 round and then these 200-ish are in that pool and then need to be, if we do a 2025, 2026 round, they just need to know, am I still in or am I now going to have to reapply? I think, was that the question, Kirk? Maybe I misunderstood. Okay.
It might be useful, sir, if you're willing, to shed some light on the conversation that the subcommittee had about the threshold mark also. And that kind of helps, with the gatekeeping of how applications are moving forward. To Kathy's point now, in terms of what might be considered at this point in time versus at a future point in time. And then to Kirk's question about sort of round one versus round two, this is really just an ongoing process. But y'all did have a conversation about the threshold for, moving applications forward in the process.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so, that's a great point, Norm, and, appreciate that. I think as we start to look across the applicants, what we'd like to do is create almost like a selection criteria that narrows it down to what we think be in the best interest of the state of Texas for what we're trying to accomplish, congruent with our strategic plan. And, we believe that, after the administrative compliance check is complete, that there's probably an opportunity after we grade as the board of directors, to set a threshold, maybe 80% based on the scoring criteria, that then only the top 20% move forward for board consideration and conversation. And so we can be arbitrary with that percent, but we did feel like the top 20% based on the scoring of the board of directors, as we move these applications through this process, would allow us to deliberate and have really good conversation on kind of that top shelf project that was presented to the commission. And so that's also up for consideration and conversation. We, as the ad hoc working group, believe that that was a good suggestion. And we think 80% or thereabouts is probably about the right number.
Sorry, just jump in. I know you didn't mean this, but I want to make sure it's clear. When you say arbitrary on the number, it's still an objective standard. When you're saying the number can be up or down.
It can be up or down. We haven't decided. That's right.
But when it's said, that is the objective.
That's
standard.
right. That's right. Yeah. We wouldn't have any flexibility, but what I'm suggesting based on the conversation is 80% was more or less the threshold that we were considering. Yeah. But be open to any conversations around that. Maybe that's
Yeah. like, I'm just, and I don't do math in my head the way Kirk does. The demand signal is so high that those that have come through compliance, and I want to thank the staff first for the dashboard system that they've set up for each of us to receive those. We're not conflicted with. This is a lot of work, and it's been very much appreciated from me to have the system the way that I can easily work with it. So thank you for that. With the volume, I like the idea of 80%. And then we can see where we are with that 80%. Anybody have any other board recommendation on what that percentage should be based on the volume?
Gwen, Kirk again, sorry. I like the idea of a threshold, just I don't know, I'll say a state question, and maybe Joseph or Norman can help, but in my federal life, if we had, again, I'll use maybe a simple example. If our budget was $10, sometimes we knew we weren't going to spend $10. So, you might kind of overbook it a little bit. And so you'd say, hey, we know we're not really going to spend $10 in this year. So obviously one option is to roll it over, which by the way is what we typically did. Or you could say, approve a higher amount knowing you're not going to spend it all. Is there legislative requirements there? So back to the 80%, right? I mean, if we said the threshold's 80% that we allocated, we won't spend 80%, but I don't know what we'll spend, but what will actually be costed, it'll be something less than that, at least initially.
So Kirk, I guess a further clarification. What we didn't discuss in the ad hoc working group was that we would only commit to spend 80% of the budget dollars, but rather it was the top 20% of the companies that we score of applicants would make it through for board discussion, and then consideration for granting whatever allocation of monies we deem appropriate. I think that hopefully clarifies some things. Not that we discuss only apportioning 80% of the budget for the grant making process, but rather only the top 20% based on our scoring criteria. And again, we're independently grading these as they come into our scoring kind of bucket, I guess, would make it through for then full board consideration and discussion. And so it would allow us to be more efficient, I guess, in paring it down to the top projects to get the commission doing its work from grant making kind of vantage point, I guess.
Okay, copy. That helps. Thanks, Brad.
Yeah, thanks.
But then Brad, how are you dealing with the grants? Have you guys as a subcommittee thought about like the rounds and kind of clarifying, is there a feedback loop on which applicants have kind of made it through this round versus what? Because I could see over time the alignment and the goals may change depending on the number of review cycle, like grant cycles the commission has, right? Obviously, this is our startup year. Establishing kind of foundational requirements, in the Texas Commission review in 2024, 2025, and our goals in 2024, 2025 from starting commission versus our goals in 2028, 2029, which I'm very optimistic will be continuing and hoping to invest in Texas at that round. Those may be different, right? So kind of going back to Kirk's question, has the subcommittee looked at tying these rounds and proposal reviews and thinking about how do we do successive rounds And then how that would apply to giving feedback to folks that have submitted for this round. Have you guys tackled that at all within the subcommittee?
Yeah, Kathy, that's a great comment observation. And I think the direction that we've received and what we have discussed really pertains to what we have to deal with right now, and that's the 150 million. We haven't looked forward at what subsequent rounds and budget we might have to deal with. And so for this initial round, I think what we understand is that if not conflicted out, each board member has the opportunity to grade and score all the applications that we've received. And so there has been no filter necessarily for this initial round of grant applications to allow us then to possibly consider, if we look forward to the future, if we do have more money, we have more opportunities to do grants, then we might choose to change the process and the filter. But right now, it's an open filter. And so this 80% threshold is really just based on the scoring of all the applications that have come in, and allows us to then spend quality time on only the top ones that have made it across the independent review of each board member that's not conflicted out. So we have not considered subsequent rounds, Kathy, to your question, very exact, but I think for the matter at hand, it's setting that threshold so we can then move forward and have a real conversation for those that we think collectively might be the best proposals to consider. And that's it.
Okay, thank you.
As I thought through this a little bit on my own, I also think about the fact that when I look back at the calendar of this last year in 2024, we didn't get started until March, being appointed. We opened the grant application September 13th. So, and this 150 million is for the biennium of 2024 and 5. So this 150, so as I was thinking back on this, because it took us a while to get started based on our appointments. Just a question for staff. We need to allocate this money before the end of 2025, correct? The 150 million.
Sure.
So we have strong demand, so.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be spent or reimbursed by that point, but encumbered and
Okay.
grantees.
So as I kind of thought through, the budget we're working with right now is really 2024, 25, and we're now in 2025. So,
With an asterisk, the legislature could do what they could reappropriate it if it wasn't spent.
Right.
But
okay. I know at the end of the meeting, I want to look at future meetings, but I know we've talked and checked calendars administratively for January 24th is our next meeting. We would put that meeting notice out on January 16th, I believe. So going back to setting the initial conversation around setting a date, I want to use the right word, not close the application process for this first round for the 150 million. Is that a proper word? Okay, deadline. I'd like to set a deadline, or makes sense to me, like that you mentioned the 21st. Is that a Monday on my calendar? Right?
Tuesday. 2 weeks
But-
from today.
To allow us time, well, we're still gonna have some, hang with me here, we're still gonna have some that are still working through compliance, because we're at the mercy of folks responding to your additional question. But ideally, when we come together on the 24th, we might be able to start a round of grants. So I just want to make sure we're working through the cycle that we have, and that as we look at the 150 million, we allow ourselves that time, staff to get through compliance, get them into our system. And that is another question that I had is, as you guys have been working in the system, I know each of us have at our own pace, and I'm sure we've each had different things we've had to learn about how to do this. are you finding that, is there a set amount of time that you really need to get through a batch? Like for example, at the 58, I believe the number was, they've been coming in chunks of about 20, for avoiding the the conflicted ones. Is a week or 2 weeks or 3, are you guys finding a rhythm yet? Because we got hit hard fast, straight out of the chute. That's why we're having today's meeting, is to talk through some of these things because we had such a demand. Any lessons learned yet?
I think there's a lot. It's, as we balance all the things we have in personal life and corporate life, and it definitely takes a lot to review. I think on that note, one of the questions I had is like, would it be possible for the board to use kind of an external professional service to provide informative, assessments about the applications? I mean, there's so much thrown at us with a vast amount of asks, and I've got my expertise, but I don't, it's really, really broad. So curious if there's ways to get help there on what's possible, what's not possible, what's so far out that's never going to happen.
Yeah. So if I might, I love that as our next parking lot. Let me put that right here for just a second. And can I come back to, do we want to set a date for a deadline for this current, the 150 million that we currently have? Is January 21st a good date for those of the board? Oh, I see John's on. Terrific. John, any chance we can count your vote with your video on?
Not a vote, just.
I mean,
so,
we're not voting,
And
sorry.
yes, Matt, I'm in charge of the process, and so give me the direction as to what
Okay.
y'all can do, so you just let him know what.
I was just hoping we could get John's face on the screen. So,
Hey, Gwen, I'd love to. My link is not working for the computer, so they sent me a link for my cell phone. So I'm on my cell phone.
Okay. All right.
Video's disabled.
Thank you for.
I'll keep working the computer.
All right. So,
And I think we move forward with a 2-week deadline from today. And just put it on the calendar and announce it today.
Okay. So Norman, can I ask you,
Yes, ma'am.
staff, to take care of that?
You can get that out, and we'll endeavor to
Okay.
work as quickly as possible
Okay.
once they come in.
Great. Now, I think there was a couple of other items in there that I want to make sure we come back to each of those. Sassy, you mentioned the idea of, a third party source. So let's hit that topic because I think that would be helpful. For example, the Institutes of Higher Education, there were 107 there. So can I ask Norman or Aaron, Joseph, talk a little bit about how we can possibly enter into an intermediary agreement?
Yes, ma'am. Joseph and I have been referred on this, so I'll ask him to kind of give a review of what we've done to date and his legal guidance on what we can do moving forward.
Yeah, sure thing. So there's multiple options. Broadly speaking, yes, an external service can be procured or contracted with. And there's multiple ways of doing that. The quickest way is to enter into an interagency contract with another entity that already has one of these relationships in place. In fact, the statute that governs this encourages that they already have to have a subcontractor or something like that to go that route. Contract management guides encourages IACs, and they're very fast. And so to identify an entity that has a state entity that has one of these in place would just be an IAC. They're very simple, very quick, and very friendly. Then there's I can go on from there. Then there's just a standard procurement process that can take anywhere from 3 weeks to 6 months to procure a service.
The IAC, is that the mechanism we use with Parsec for the workshops?
Yes, that was an interagency.
With Texas?
That's it.
Okay, just to clarify that. So, so Sassy, to the answer to that question, it sounds like it's yes. Further discussion on that? There's Dr. Wilson.
I think it would be a prudent call for the board to have more of a technical expert kind of grade out not necessarily that they're selecting. That's still left to the board. I think the ad hoc working group made it very clear that we don't want to abdicate our responsibility of selecting. But we would like feedback on very technical proposals, and most of which we might not necessarily have the credentials or experiences and skill sets to grade those ourselves. But I think it's a great idea.
Just to clarify, for discussion, or that's in alignment with some of the applications from institutes of higher education
That's
for
right.
research in particular.
That's right.
Sassy, is that kind of where you were thinking as well?
Yeah, I think mostly that's where I'm thinking, but I think there's even areas within just industrial expertise, and maybe we have enough expertise in the room that we're okay there, but for sure, higher education.
Other topics for discussion on the question of a third party withdrew an IAC for this morning? We've got some other-
What's the process of moving forward on that if we all agreed it was the best path?
So Joseph and I have identified a couple of opportunities
Okay.
that as he described, what the path forward could look like. We understand that it can be executed in a matter of days. We've already identified what the potential scope of work or statement of services ought to do. Of course, then we need to actually enter into a negotiation with establishing or executing that IAC. But some initial assessments in terms of the potential of a deliverable is approximately as quick as 45 days. Once we start sharing some of these applications for review. And then that would be a new data point for the board members during their evaluation process. We would upload that content to the SharePoint dashboard so that you all can then also include that as part of your reviews when you're evaluating those applications for scores.
And that addresses what the ad hoc subcommittee or the grant process subcommittee was discussing.
At least for the time being, for the institutes of higher education, that way we're consistent and standard across that genre.
So
Would that mean that there's a different schedule for that set of proposals?
That
Should
data
we be
point-
talking about a different schedule if there's a 45-day assessment that needs to be fed into our round? Is that something we should be talking about?
So that extra data point is certainly up for your consideration to hold on assessing these applications. But once Aaron certifies that they're complete from an administrative standpoint, if anybody so chooses to actually begin that evaluation minus that extra data point, you're certainly able to do so. But otherwise, we actually still need verification because that was just an initial estimate of time. We need final verification once we execute an IAC with whichever provider we ultimately use on what that time window looks like or time frame looks like. And then we come back and update everybody on what that actual data point is. But then, yes, ma'am, it could potentially mean more time before y'all are evaluating those specific applications.
So,
Yeah, I think one of the things, just for the commission's consideration, I think the more information we can give people that are doing their planning, because obviously people are planning work based on whether they get this grant or not. And so I don't know if there's a way for us to be able to inform or just a consideration, maybe Brad, for the subcommittee to be thinking about, are there timeframes or is there a possibility of ways to inform people on when, their proposals through different stages, so that there's a level of planning people can do. I don't know if we've thought about that, but
and as the board, if I'm thinking clearly here, as the board, as directors, we don't want to be in touch with those grant applicants to give them updates. That would be a staff
yeah,
feedback.
But at least for people to know where they are. I just don't, it's just something to consider, Brad, I guess, for the subcommittee. Maybe it'd be good to just, obviously, each of us are going through the review process, but if there's parts in our assessment and steps that are, or wanting more feedback or data along the way, I do feel like having people understand where they are helps in their decision process along the way.
I'm in agreement, Kathy, and I think we'll bake that into our ad hoc working group discussions and come back with some, guidance and feedback based on what we discussed. So that's great. Thanks, Kathy.
And so 2 points, I want to make sure that I'm clear. Going with a third party to help assess the research and technical aspects of something, it doesn't mean that they still have to go through our compliance
Yes, ma'am.
team. So I just want to be clear that they're still going through compliance, and then they would be reviewed also by a third party of experts that.
So,
Okay.
information.
Okay. And then the second part was, just put it out there to the board. Since we know there's going to be some time frame, whether it's 45 days or 30 days or whatever, in utilizing a third party, we haven't necessarily said, we haven't talked about, allocating of the 150 million that we have right now to utilize, in my mind, and I'd like to open it for discussion, we look at, and I'm going to use numbers like you did, Kirk, but, say 20 of the 150, like we take this in some, I don't know if tranches is an okay word to use, but that we want to make sure, because we know we still have a number of them still going through compliance. We know we have the 107 that technical nature. So I want to make sure too, that as we look at our 150 million that we currently have to allocate as grants, that we're considering those we haven't seen yet. That's a long way to get to it, but it seems like if we, and I don't know that we have to put a hard number to it, but that it's our intent. I'd like to open that up for discussion, that we begin to issue some grants, knowing there's more that still came in within that deadline that we haven't seen yet.
Are you suggesting, Gwen, so that we could get going, that we would have, I'll call it an initial ceiling on what we would do in certain areas so that we would reserve money to consider those remaining apps? Is that what you're talking about?
I think so.
Actually, if I may,
Please.
might actually recommend calling Blake to give an example of a set aside that was done. Now, this isn't an action because it's not an actual agenda item, but for conversation's sake, it's an example that Blake can share that was done on the chip side for an exact comparison.
Absolutely, please.
That's right. We had a very similar conversation with them over there, in the context of a lot of federal CHIPS money was coming down. So the board was trying to contemplate, what do they try to do near term? But as the Federal CHIPS Act, and as they were trying to get money out the door, how much do they leave back in the event that opportunities arose? So not necessarily apples to apples, but a very similar scenario. And so what the CHIPS board ended up doing is doing it administratively, just as direction to staff. That way, it wasn't a motion that had to be undone if they needed to go smaller, larger, anything else, but gave that flexibility that as Norman, Aaron, myself, and the rest of the team are tracking what is going out the door, we have knowledge of, okay, you have X amount left. You said that you wanted to set aside Y. And so that way it's more of just a flag for the board of where you are currently in grant awards. This is how much you said that you wanted to contemplate for these entities. And so you do that administratively, and we just keep you in the loop as that progresses. And then you're not beholden to an official action, an official amount that then could ultimately tie your hands on future grant.
Does that hit Mr. Chairman's comment or question?
Yeah, I think, what we were all struggling with is this notion that we'd like to get started as soon because it's a big elephant we're about to eat. And, but some of it's going to be delayed, right? 2 months down the road. If things move really quick, it'll be 2 months down the road where they can even be really acted upon. How do we make sure we don't, temporally prioritize things? And so the approach that Blake described sounds fine too. We can just keep an eye on it as a board. That's fine. Just as long as we have an approach, seems like good. Otherwise, we'll spend all the money up front and we'll have some great ideas in the end and we won't be able to support that. But what you're describing helps us at least consciously do that as we're going through. So it addresses what I was concerned about anyway. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. We need to, we want to show action, right? Because we want to be able to show, to me, it's important to show that we're starting to invest the money that the state's given us. But I think it's tied to having the deadline. There's a season for this money and we want it to start, getting pollen. We want it to start seeding our economic engine here in Texas right now. And so to do that, we got to get it out there. But yet on the other hand, we want to make sure that we're doing our fiduciary responsibility, but we've got to put a deadline on this investment with the hope that we're getting another set of investment dollars to be able to continue this investment cycle, right? But it's definitely about also making sure we're being fair with the applicants who are investing their time in this round. And so making it clear what this round is tied to and that we're being fair in the process of assessing this huge influx of proposals while being transparent where we are in the process, I think is very, very important.
I want to make sure in everything we've talked about in this section so far, because I know there are a few other questions that I want to hit on. Few other topics, not questions, but topics that I want to hit on. Did we answer all of those? We've said January 21st for a deadline. We are going to stay close to staff as we begin to, we're all individually scoring in the platform, what percentage have come through compliance. We'll just keep an overall awareness of situational awareness over how many grants we've looked at that are in this initial round for the 150 million. Okay, so
What about the threshold that makes it through post scoring? Do we want to charge staff to hold it out? And was it 80%, 75%? I think we need to settle on that too, right?
We discussed the subcommittee's recommendation of 80%. I don't think I heard any different recommendations, so we take that as guidance unless there's anything else for the conversation.
and to me, I think we look at that 80% as we each, look at that and see where we land. And
question on that. This is Heather. When you say 80%, do you mean an average 4 out of 5 score? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
yeah. A couple of the other big topics that I want to make sure in this next hour that we hit on. Hopefully one of those thoughts that I had can read pretty quick. One of the questions I have, what are permissible uses of the CERF trust beyond issuing grants? I wanted to kind of open that for discussion as we talk today. Because I know in our last meeting, you gave a financial report, Norman, and of that 150 million, the interest that is built in that has given us a nice administrative budget, I guess I would classify it as, so that we can utilize this 150 million for actual grants or some of these other things. So can we talk about that a little bit and maybe Blake and those of you that have been working these sorts of things, Norman, you know, what other things can Joseph, maybe over to you, can we use this these trusts?
Yeah, you want to go first?
Sure.
Yeah, so the SERF fund, or SERF is a unique fund because it's a trust fund held outside the treasury, which means a lot of the standard limitations that are in statute are not directly applicable to the SERF fund.
Right.
Because it's a trust fund held outside the treasury, it's the Attorney General's previously opined that it's not held by the state in its sovereign capacity, so it's looked at a little bit different.
Okay.
Which is both freeing because it expands the uses of money, but it's also it's a tremendous weight on the board because it's a trust fund. And so y'all have to administer it as such. And so the uses of the fund have to meet the question of is this expenditure for the purpose of what this fund was established for? So it was established for, the statute doesn't give a whole lot of guidance, but it does give some guidance in the General Appropriations Act. The reasons it was established were for the establishment and administration of the Space Commission, and also to provide grants to eligible entities as provided by Chapter 482 of the Government Code. That's as much guidance as we have. Establishment and administration, provide grants as established, as provided for Chapter 482 of the Government Code. That last piece is really important, and I'm sorry to get too much in the weeds. Maybe Blake, he's really good at translating me. It makes sense. And essentially, Chapter 42 has a lot of things that y'all have to do. All right, and as provided by Chapter 42, that does a lot of work. And so broadly speaking, the few questions to ask whenever these expenditure questions are asked are is this for the purposes for which the trust was established? And so that's why administration, for instance, can be in there. Grant review is the input from this external third party, which, so I'm clear, you want us to move forward on that? Was that established? Okay. The third party, like all of these are contemplated as use of the trust fund. And so, the best rule of thumb is to follow that implies the GR, to general revenue. And then where there are some places where, because it's a trust fund, it needs to be diverted and get changed a little bit because of the special nature of this trust fund. Those sort of discussions with the board. Yeah. I can keep going on HOTS for, I'm not sure if I made it clear or less.
What comes to your mind, Blake?
No, and just to cover it, it is tricky because Chapter 42 governs, but the main thing is the establishment and administration, which we've touched on. That's the OpEx, right? The day-to-day paying staff and travel and everything that we need to do on the staff side. But then providing those grants to the eligible entities for those specific purposes. So the 5 eligible entities, and then the 5 categorically, or the 5 statutory categories, creation of post-mission material, things like that. For those specific purposes, those are the primary or the only uses of the trust fund.
Since, as a discussion here amongst the board, have you guys been thinking of any thoughts on anything else that we might want to ask staff about now while we're together? The uses of the funds? Not to put you on the spot, but it's a chance for us to have the conversation.
This is Heaven. I apologize. We had difficulty with the links and so forth, but have you talked about indirect costs already?
Not yet. And I think that was one of the biggie next steps. So.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Cassie, were you?
Yeah, so I just want to make sure, because it cut out a tiny bit. So we can use it for OpEx, establishment, administration of Space Commission, and then providing grants. Those are the 2 categories that and there's nothing else we can use it for, or did I get that clear?
That's correct. Yeah. The establishment administration and providing grants as provided by Chapter 482.
Is that an and or an or, Joseph? Because I was hearing an and, meaning it had to meet both of those criteria versus one or the other.
it's an and, but only in the sense that it can be used for this purpose, and this purpose. It doesn't have to meet all those criteria.
Okay, just as long as it meets one of those criteria, we're good. Copy, thank you.
So some ideas along those lines, when that, I've had, and, I think maybe even in conversations in our working group for the grant stuff, so this pertains to the grant. What if, aligned with our grant making, charge, we were able to use some of that to, create more public-private partnership, opportunities where there might be, let's say, federal dollars that flow in for a specific purpose around national security space, Texas Space Commission, combined with those monies to then allocate to those strategic priorities that align to both national security space mission as well as Texas space, commercial space development. So those might be some really interesting areas. And then private capital markets access, where we truly create private-public partnership where the state, alongside of private capital market participants, are able to infuse their dollars into specific initiatives that they see benefit, financially speaking. So those are two examples that we might want to consider.
Like an accelerator is what pops in my mind, Di.
It could be that there's a private commercial entity with a private capital fund that is there to really drive it, and the Space Commission is involved and somehow as the public participant in that kind of an initiative. And I have heard things about a late stage accelerator where it's not necessarily early stage, where it's closer to moving things into the commercial market rather than seed stage investment and accelerator. That seems to be a gap from what I've heard, specifically in the space industry sector. I know that some of the demand signal came from U.S. Space Force S5SQ at the Pentagon. They would value maybe something like that, maybe something for us to consider.
Those things where we could get
So
more specific.
I don't know. It's a short answer.
Yeah.
Some of these I have to get more specifics on.
Right.
Some of those that just first blush does sound like there ought to be some statutory changes in order to reach some of those, particularly with regard to I'm not sure if this in that contemplated that, but as far as like using like the federal projects with state grant dollars, that is not allowed under Chapter 42, so it wouldn't be allowed. And even if somebody donates something, because the commission can receive grants and donations, that money it takes on the same nature as any other money that the commission would have, right? And so let's say this money can be used for a million purposes over here. It comes to the commission, it can be used for the 5 purposes, that's set for. And so I can't answer this. I can't answer whether that would be possible right now, but maybe learn a little bit more. I mean, if those take the form of grants for one of the 5 eligible purposes, then there's a possibility there. But use a lot of big words on that. So I'll have to learn.
Well, if we can multiply the dollars,
Right.
like,
Yeah, I mean, there's no, in an application process, if somebody says we have this much and if we're able to get this much from the state, they're separate, but you can leverage state dollars, like that's a good thing, right? It's not a requirement, but it's also not a bad thing. But if there's commingling and there's money and this kind of, it can get real complicated.
Okay.
So we need to have further discussions about that. And it sounds like statutory changes would probably be.
And remind me again, what amount we'd really be even talking about that was in the interest area? I'm just trying to figure out if this should be our focus right
The
now.
interest to date on the 150.
Approximately 80 million.
Okay.
Okay, so, right.
All right, I'd like to shift gears. Dr. Wilson brought up a topic that I think is a big one. I know in my ad hoc work group that I want to discuss openly is indirect costs. And so in looking at other I want to use our term, agencies of the state, other commissions within Texas, looking at what other state space commissions are doing, you know, and how they do or don't, provide indirect costs. That has been, as I'm out in communities in the space industry, you know, that's been a hot topic of whether indirect costs will be covered. So I'd like to open that up for discussion, and then any insight staff through research may be able to clarify for us as well. It seems to be an emotional topic in the industry, one way or the other, so.
Dr. Wilson, have anything more to add at the start of this?
Perhaps I can start. You know, you gave us a list of some current rules and with respect to state grants. Those are very different, very wide variety of different kinds of things there. If a grant is for a piece of equipment or for some capital expenditure, usually if it's for equipment, there's very little reason for there to be facilities and administrative expense on top of that. If it is for capital, often if we get a capital grant from the state to build a new facility or something, there's a maximum amount. We know how it's financed, and there's a percentage of that that goes to design and project management and so forth. So it's all incorporated in the capital grant itself. With respect to research, and it may be different at corporations, so others can jump in, but with respect to universities, we have a federally audited rate. So they actually come in and audit. We know what our facilities expense is and what our administrative expense is per dollar of direct research done. So if a researcher is working in a lab, we know what those rates are. And then there is a negotiated rate that's actually lower than the actual cost from the federal government. There are some grants, like from the Department of Education, their title grants and so forth, where overhead is limited to no more than 8%. But overall, an R1 institution should be averaging about 35%, is what the national average is for R1 institutions for facilities and administrative expense. What that does is shift the cost of doing research into two places: to tuition and fees, so you're shifting it to undergraduate students, and in a case of a state institution, to the state directly in the way that universities are funded, and we draw down a certain amount of state funds for the semester credit hours that we offer. But in any way you look at it, we're shifting those costs to others because they are real audited costs. Now, if the state is going to say there will be no overhead expenditure, so you're not going to cover any facilities and you're not going to cover any administrative expense, and you want to do research and you really want to drive research, not equipment, not capital, but research, there's probably going to be a limit to what universities are willing to do. And they're going to have to take that into account when they decide what proposals to do. The faculty are quite happy to do that because they don't pay rent, they don't keep the lights on, they don't hire people, they don't do finance, all of those things that keep a university running. That some of them will, because they often get a certain percentage that they can allocate themselves. But there's a wide variety of rules that's more driven by the type of grant, as well as the fact that the state does support education. With a private university, I don't know how they would do it. Probably take money out of their other funds, and also they shift it to undergraduate students. That's the reality of research at institutions, and I won't belabor that anymore. Thank you.
Others from the small business side, the corporate side, the investor side. I know companies that have had federal funding are used to having a percentage of that reimbursed, but we're a state entity. And I know early on in our Q&A, I believe it states that we would not reimburse indirect costs. But this is the time for us to be able to talk together about this topic.
And Heather, you said I'm sorry, Dr. Wilson, you said the the number you guys use is 35%? I just,
No,
is
that's
that
the average.
standard? The average, okay.
That is the average federal F&A rate that we actually recover. Our audited rate is much higher than that. But when you get a Department of Education federal grant for students for Pell Grants or other kinds of things, it's an 8% cap there. So overall, our audited rate is actually high, almost double that as an R1 institution. But R1 institutions nationwide will average about 35% in their actual federal recovery. It varies grant by grant. And as I said, I think part of the thing we need to discuss is what is the grant for? There's no reason if you're giving an equipment grant or a construction grant to add significant overhead to it. If you're doing operations or research, you need to accept that somebody else is going to be paying for that.
Is there any requirement that we'd have to change our current statute we're governed by?
So indirect, so most places where there are indirect costs allowed in the grant context, it is specifically detailed in statute. Through my research, and it says here's the indirect cost rate. There are some agencies have more flexibility, and that's not a general rule. So short answer, it would be great, but it's not necessary on the indirect cost piece. With one caveat is that, again, this is a trust fund held outside of Treasury. And at these funds, there's a tension here, right? Indirect costs by their nature, and pull the definition from federal regs, the cost not readily identified with a specific project or organizational activity, but incurred for the joint benefit of multiple projects or other activities. Indirect costs are usually grouped into common pools and charged to benefiting objectives through an allocation process or indirect cost rate. So in kind of in the federal context, in most contexts, indirect costs by their nature are not allocable to not directly allocable to a specific project. So when you have a trust fund, those dollars have to be directly allocated to a specific project. You have an internal tension there. So, well, I guess maybe I'll modify my answer. Yes, I think we'd have to have direct. It would be best to have direct approval through the statute for the indirect costs. And I love your good insight. Yeah. One thing and to note, kind of some of the deep dive into some of the statutes and to some of what the other agencies do. I know the governor's office, we don't do any indirect costs for any program except for in some public safety office grants, but those are usually federally funded. And another one is, and I know CHIPS and space are not directly the same, but like we don't have indirect costs available in that either. And we have been very happy with the number of educational institutions that have applied. One important note, because oftentimes people think salary means indirect cost, and that's not the case, right? Salaries that are allocated directly to a project are directly allocated to a project, right? Now, fringe benefits, travel, a lot of those things that are on top of that could not be paid, but actual direct salaries for endeavors could be reimbursed because as long as they can show us the straight line.
That's a great point.
Yeah, I was gonna comment on, for the CHIPS program, the research component, we mirrored what the Governor's University Research Initiative does, and they don't allow indirect costs for that reason, because it's broad and it's not allocated to a specific project.
If they're project-specific overheads, I would assume those are treated as part of the project budget and allowable. Is that a correct understanding? Because there's certain different definitions for indirect costs, and I think to Heather's point, if you're using a specific physical property and equipment attached to a research development activity, that is all contained within a specific project budget, not necessarily lives outside of the indirect cost structures that you can't discriminate clearly, and so you spread those SG&A costs out like peanut butter. So any thoughts on that? Yeah.
At a university, that's not the way it's done. So, so now if there's a specific piece of equipment that can be charged to a grant because we're going to use that piece of equipment and we know how many hours, and we can put that in a grant proposal. But faculty are not charged rent for their laboratories. They are not. I don't believe that it would be shocking to me if well, I'd have to go back and look, but I don't think that benefits are an indirect cost. I think those are in the hourly rate for a faculty member. But it is basically the cost of running the university beyond the individual researcher's time. And as I said, research doesn't pay at any university. It's not a profit center. There is a certain amount of cost shifting already kind of built into the assumptions because we don't recover full overhead. We never get our full overhead. Or even with the federal government, we have a negotiated rate that's significantly below what they have audited as the actual overhead cost. This is not some number the university comes up with. But as a group, we need to understand that is shifting costs to undergraduate students or to other elements of the state. And that's the reality. And every university has a certain amount of latitude to how much it's going to do of that.
Couple of thoughts. So with CHIPS, they're following the Governor's University Research Initiative, and so no indirect costs are being reimbursed for CHIPS.
They're structured similarly. I don't know. I don't remember that being part of the discussion that GURI was the basis for that determination. I'll try to remember better than I. But they're structured similarly for sure.
And then for sake of discussion, we've hit a lot on universities here, but I also want to think about the private business, the nonprofits, and the public companies as well.
If there is a federal rate for a small business, and I long ago used to run one, and you don't allow overhead costs, there are a lot of small businesses who won't be able to do the work. Larger businesses may be able to, I mean, Kirk, you would know this better than I, they have certain flexibility on what independent research and development has done and so forth. But these are real costs. This is not, it's not, the people who are concerned about this are not concerned without reason. And I think their concerns are at least partially legitimate. And I think we need to think about that.
I guess my question, forgive me, but I'd like to talk about some of these other sectors, but has it affected people applying for CHIPS grants? They have a lot more resources than we currently have today to grow that ecosystem. And as we think about the best use of this $150 million that we have to support and grow the space ecosystem here in Texas for the good of our nation and beyond,
So just from UTEP is not involved in CHIPS directly, but just as first of all, it's a much larger program. There's significant federal funds, and in the case of the University of Texas, there were hundreds of millions of dollars of University of Texas funds put in to those projects. So there were other sources of funds to cover what wasn't being covered out of other state funds.
A small business owner, that's the way I've always looked at it, is I have to find other ways to cover those costs. So anybody work from the big company perspective, or John and Sassy from Venus Aerospace, any discussion here?
If I could, first of all, the shifting of cost is what happens, right? I mean, you have to have lights. Frankly, if you live in the state of Texas, you have to have air conditioning. Heating is optional, but air conditioning is required. Insurance, right? All those things that get wrapped up that are not really allocable. They just can't be direct. You just can't really do it. They'll have to be borne some other way. So there'll be a cost shifting, much like Dr. Wilson was describing. I think small companies, it's harder, I'm sure. The question in my mind is, so what's the implication, right? So these costs aren't there. How does that manifest in us not meeting our goals? So if we're trying to foster the aerospace industry in the state of Texas, does this have a material impact on that or not? So I think for large businesses, it's probably not. Small businesses, I don't know. And frankly, it's going to be hard to measure because you can't ask the people who applied because they've already figured out what they're going to do. What you really have to do is poll the people who decided not to apply. And I'm not exactly sure how you gather data. So I don't know. I think what's going through my head is how do we gather some data to help us point in the direction of whether or not this is a material impact to what we could be doing to foster the space industry, the aerospace industry in the state of Texas. And I don't know, maybe one suggestion is we number one, establish a rule not to use, for instance, like no indirect costs in this round, but we actually create I'll say a portal or we task, I don't know, the staff, Norman or somebody to go help find out if this is having an impact. Who didn't apply because of this reason, or who only applied once and could have applied 5 times and didn't do 5 projects because of this. That's the kind of information we need. I personally just don't have any background to tell you. So maybe some of the other board members do, but I would say I think what we need to be open to is what is the impact to our goals, and if it's impacting our goals, we ought to go change the rule.
Do we have the ability to approve and allocate indirect costs to these?
Yeah, I mean, to kind of, I spoke a lot earlier, and apologies for that. I mean, the tension that I see, and the reason why the council previously, we should not go the indirect cost route, is because of the trust fund versus what an indirect cost is. The trust fund dollars have to be spent for the purposes of the chapter and specifically allocable to the project. By their nature, they're not allocable to the project. So I think there's an internal tension there that would increase risk of negative feedback on the board's actions if there's not specific authorization for indirect costs.
Okay, so what I hear you say is that it would be very difficult for us to even allow for indirect costs given the nature of the trust fund that we have to be the fiduciary over.
I think that would.
Okay. So then is this a moot point?
It's one we have to discuss, but that is a good question. Is it a moot point? But then I don't know on in APRIT, they do 5% specifically directed in it's a statute. I don't know if they're structured as a trust outside.
No, they're general.
Okay, so there's all these different things that we're looking at, or,
And I guess, is it clear that, from a small business standpoint, and Sassy, I'd love for your thoughts on this. I would assume other direct costs, which are costs other than salaries and fringe benefit, can be recouped as part of the grant process because they live above the indirect cost line. Have we established that? And just so we're clear on definitions.
of what's eligible.
Of what's eligible, if you're, again, working on a project as a private business, and I can't speak for the academic research part, but you would allocate, facilities and cost to operate those facilities, that you can discriminate, as part of your other direct cost, application. And so I would think that is, well within reason that a grantee could apply those ODCs, as they call it, to that kind of a project-based budget baseline. So I'd love thoughts on that.
If I may, unfortunately, it depends answer, and we've done our best to go in and look at the applications. Aaron actually has gone, with Joseph's help, to quantify as best possible out of that 219 applications that are sitting in our pool for compliance and evaluation. How many have described elements that could be defined as indirect costs? So maybe it'd be useful context to share what her number is. I think that speaks as an answer to your question of what is and isn't, but I think I think it's in.
Just while you're looking at that, I think you're getting at something. I couldn't see who's speaking. I'm sorry, but that one of the easiest way to manage a research project is to use validated, audited indirect costs. Alternatively, if we're going to parse these things, we can certainly charge our researchers for their electricity and their water and their space and just put that in the grant as rent. But that accomplishes the same thing. And I'm not sure we're really, it's a whole lot easier to just be straight about this.
Fair.
Did you find?
Yeah, so again, since it's it depends answer, it's a very, very rough estimate that just would require us going back to applicants and sussing out some of what they claimed in their budget. But there could be around 140 of those 219 applications may have IBC contemplated, but.
And that's based off of, Brad, I think what you were getting at here, what is defined, what are those terms, and how are they going to be processed? I think it will, to Aaron's point, in order to really drill down, require that more effort, that additional effort to go back and say, here's the information you provided to us in the budget scope of our application questionnaire. What did you mean? And so that's that extra layer of information from applicants to truly drill down into those different objects or those different examples that you're describing of what does and doesn't fit into the bucket.
I'm not sure where to take this discussion, to be honest, it's like.
To Brad's previous point of whether or not this is moot or not, Joseph's provided a legal guidance.
Right.
So that's where we stand from the perspective of the board's information.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
No, just a point of clarification, if I could, maybe. So I heard what Joseph said about, I guess what I'm asking is Joseph, was your opinion about, hey, indirect costs are not allowed by statute or by the current legislation? Is that, I don't know how to say this in the right legal terms. Is that your opinion or is that the opinion? In other words, is there, and maybe that's the same, I don't know. I mean, is there typically, there's a court case somewhere that says it and there's a precedent, or I don't know. In other words, if I asked another attorney, could I get a different opinion, or is that pretty much the?
That's a great question. And I wish I could say, I wish I could use the definite article and say it is the opinion, but it is my opinion. I've read almost every attorney general opinion on trust fund held outside the treasury. There's not a lot of guidance on this. But I can say that trust fund dollars have to be used for the purpose for which they were created. And if they are not used for that purpose, that there's a number of audit findings that I've seen throughout the state. I give counsel in that direction. I think it is higher risk to provide indirect costs if there can be a direct line shown from a project to a cost. Then that's we can discuss that. But I think indirect costs are an inherent tension with the trust fund held outside the treasury. With that specific authorization statute.
So is this something, I'm trying to think of a path forward here. Is this something that could be discussed? I think each of our 3 ad hoc work groups that we have working regularly, is this something we should further discuss in ad hoc work groups? And then discuss again in our next open meeting?
It'll be beneficial. I can work up a one-pager on kind of the research that I have here. and share that with the board members and the ad hoc workers, walk through step by step, the legal reasoning that, if that would be helpful.
I think that's great. The other thing that I'll add, I mean, it's well known, if anybody's gone to any of the meetings that any of us have been at, this question has come up. And so the answer that has been provided to date has been based off of that previous legal guidance. And so in the auspices of the current pot of applications that have been received, everybody has heard the answer as indirect costs is not eligible as part of this grant application process. If through this exercise, Joseph sharing extra information and walking through the conversations of ad hoc work group meetings, should that change in direction that the board takes, I could anticipate from the external perspective, this could start to look a little break and more confusion in the process for whatever that's worth.
And going back to Kirk's point before, we do have data. We have that we've given the answer as it's not included. And we have a demand signal of 3 billion against our 150. So we at least have that data. So I do think, I mean, it's probably worth a discussion, but for future ones, but just kind of going back to getting clarity for the existing ones. We do at least have that data.
My guess is for the research proposals, they're counting on if they are given a grant, they will negotiate the budget and the final budget will shift what are called, you're currently putting in the category of indirect costs into the direct costs of doing business. Because if it's a small one, it doesn't really matter that much. But if it's significant, it's not going to be your researcher that objects. It'll be the vice president for research who will say, no, we're not going to carry you on this, or they need to find, what's your sustainability plan and so forth. So I suspect that's probably what's happening. And they're hoping that we'll change our mind.
So and that's the category we haven't had reviewed yet, Dr. Wilson. So that's important.
Yeah. Okay. Really good discussion, and one that we knew we needed to have in an open meeting so we could all talk together. So moving forward in the time that we have remaining, one other topic that's come up in the ad hoc work group that I'm in is, what's the process for approving the grants for reimbursement, like the reimbursement versus, what's the word I'm looking for, advanced grants. I wanted to open up that conversation because, when we're out there in the communities, that's a question that has come up for me at least. And it's my understanding that the state prefers to reimburse because the tracking mechanisms are much easier to understand. But I thought we should have a discussion around that as well.
I think it starts with, if I may,
Please.
Legal guidance that's both in the General Appropriations Act as well as other parts of the code that describes grants writ large, separate and apart specifically from our grant program. So I'll call it just again.
Sure, thanks. That would be talking so much. What the important thing to keep in mind is that it's a constitutionally prohibited act to give public funds to private individuals. It's prohibited by Article 3, Section 51 of the Texas Constitution. Now, that has been parsed through over time, court opinions, AG opinions have given a lot of good guidance on this. And so ultimately where the guidance rests is we can give grants if there's legislature has told them again, which they have, and have to serve a public purpose. And there have to be sufficient controls in place to make sure the public purpose is accomplished. We have the authorization to give grants. Clearly, the legislature believes it's a good public purpose. It's the controls piece that takes paramount here. Paramount focus here. And so in the advance versus reimbursement approach, reimbursement, as you mentioned, Glenn, it's easier to not give money than to get money back that's already been spent. And so while the General Appropriations Act allows for reimbursement or as needed, this is what they call the advancement, as needed are very rare. for the primary purpose of control. The ultimate effect is maybe a 30-day difference in when somebody can get the money because it's, or actually might be a 3-month because there's quarterly reporting as the grant agreements are set up. And so that's the biggest difference. You spend the money and then get reimbursed versus pushing it out. They spend it and then if there's a problem, the control is much harder to exercise. Yeah.
And
I had a question about maybe the topic. I was thinking something different. That I was thinking you're saying, hey, for instance, I did some research last year, so I want you to pay me back for that research last year. Versus what I would call a very tactical situation, which is what Joseph was describing. Is, hey, I have to put in an order for a new mass spec on credit and you'll pay me back. That's a different kind of deal. Are we talking, when you talk about reimbursement, which flavor of reimbursement are you talking about? Is it talking about?
It's the latter. It's the latter, right? It's not, we did this previously, can you give us our money back? Or can you give us some money for that? It is, we have a grant agreement in place, expenditures from when that grant agreement is in place going forward. There's a quarterly report. They say we spent this much, here's our receipts. And then we reimburse them up to whatever the grant agreement authorizes. Yeah.
Are we able to negotiate, depending on the type of project or grantee, the type of mechanism? Because, for example, might be a material threshold where it doesn't make sense to do a lot of reimbursement and go through the red tape of that. And that might be more suitable to a small business or even a principal investigator-led research endeavor versus a public company that is working, or maybe even a large nonprofit that's working on a much larger infrastructure initiative where, maybe we do want to put more of a control in place. And what would be your guidance and counsel on that? And I'd be
so we are constitutionally prohibited from giving $1 or $10 million without sufficient controls. And so, is there less of an impact if for some reason we can't call back a $30,000 grant? Yes, that there's less of an impact. But we still have to consider whether the controls in place are sufficient for that instance. And so, that's the thing. There's still a risk there. The risk impact is smaller, but there's still a risk that we don't get the money back if we don't have sufficient controls in place. So, but there are certain circumstances in which an advanced grant would make sense. For reasons of timeline or for, there's any number of them. And in fact, they're in our chapter 320 Aaron does a really good job on some of these things that specifies these direct award grants. And so there are certain circumstances, but as a general rule, reimbursement is the best way to go.
And at what point would that conversation happen with a potential grantee? Like, is it in the contract phase, or are we saying, because it sounds like legally it's reimbursement, but if there's is it in the contract conversation where that would come up, we need this piece of equipment to do this, and, or they have to go secure a loan somewhere else. I'm just a little confused on
I think
timing.
one of the terms of art that Joseph mentioned was in statute as needed. And so I think maybe part of the conversation needs to revolve around that phrase. And then that informs, I think, your question now, ma'am, on when would that occur. But first, that threshold would be as needed. I think that's what Joseph was referencing. Aaron had done some checking on some other comparisons. So maybe between the two of them, they can share that context for perspectives.
Yeah, so right, I think as needed is a great way of looking at it. Essentially, they have a default reimbursement, and then when we look at a public service, right? So the public purpose, sometimes the public purpose is different, and it requires very fast speed. And the only way to do it to have sufficient controls is to and still meet the sufficient control requirement is to go the advanced route. So really it's situational.
Okay,
And when do we have that discussion? It would need to happen, probably before the grant agreement. It goes into place because, you know, it's got to memorialize all of those things and really just practically speaking, we need to know, you know, how this is administratively accomplished.
so based on our, go ahead.
Mechanically, I think
Yeah.
that also it should be contemplated as y'all are evaluating a particular application.
Yeah.
So we can't really have conversations about hypotheticals until we're really in the weeds about a particular opportunity. And so as y'all are going through those evaluations and maybe something rises to the level of conversation in our ad hoc work group meetings that we regularly meet as, that could be a potential opportunity for said conversation. Joseph has already prepared the template of a grant agreement on the reimbursement model, which is available on our website already for the public,
Right.
both for the governmental nonprofit entities as well as the businesses as well. So I think the question first is, as y'all are going through the evaluation process, should something catch your attention, we discuss it. Then it is part of the evaluation process, so it's through that way. And then next, it's whether or not ultimately it meets the threshold, and then obviously is the decision point at the end of the day as well.
We might have to make a default position of reimbursement, but we reserve the right to make exceptions per project.
And then y'all also have the opportunity during the open meeting for an application that meets that threshold, that comes before the full board for additional conversation about this one here, I believe, should require conversation about an advance.
And staff will know that.
That's part of y'all's feedback that you would provide to us during those ad hoc work group meetings when you're going
Okay. Through the detail.
through your evaluation process. And then when we bring to y'all in an open meeting, the conversation takes place there.
I'd like to hear other comments on that.
Yeah, the piece that comes to mind for me as a smaller startup business is, you know, carrying that capital cost as a startup versus like the larger companies or the universities that have the money sitting in their bank accounts. So I think you're putting the small companies at risk, and maybe there's a discussion where, you know, based on size of company that, you know, you could do an advance versus you know, versus a reimbursement. You know, or as long as the reimbursement's fast enough based upon your, you know, your accounts receivable or accounts payable, then that's a different, you know, different piece.
So what's the normal disbursement timeline?
Quarterly, at the end of every quarter, within 20 days, they submit a report. And our financial services division pays it out very fast. I mean, they're required to pay it out in 30 days, but it's usually much faster than that.
Okay.
Yeah, I think to Sandy's point, though, 120-day turn on that to a small business does matter. So, you know, I think as long as we have flexibility and reserve the right to make exceptions, I think that's where we need to have that kind of in the back of our mind.
For me, it's digging deep into the applications as we score them individually, looking at that risk mitigation and solvency and yeah, successes and milestones to date. So it's really on us, and then it makes sense. So that was, so talking about advance versus reimbursement, that was a big topic. Let me open it up. Other questions that we haven't hit on from others before I jump to more on my list in the time that we have.
One of the ones, Gwen, that we haven't discussed is partial funding for grant proposals. And I'd be interested to discuss that. You know, I mean, there's some folks that have asked for giant amounts of capital, you know, some,
More than
you
we
know,
even have.
more than we even have, exactly. And so
Like, how do we do that? So, No, that was my next topic, so very good. Let's open that up. So what is the mechanism or option, to look at partial grant funding for any of these applications, I guess I would say?
I'd ask Blake to chime in and
Sure. So the board has broad authority to objectively award any amount up to the total amount that is requested by an applicant for this project of expenses that are eligible within that application. So, as y'all are going through and reviewing applications, part of the consideration can be if partial funding is awarded, will a proposed project be fully achieved? I mean, will they be able to execute on it? And so from that, and y'all have seen the application, but the application contains fields for the applicant to fill out project phases, timelines. And so then while y'all do have the ability to fund multi-year projects, if it is a phase one that y'all are seeking to fund in the near term, and then there's nothing prohibiting them from coming back for phase two at a later date. And so that is part of that objective model that you can then use, saying, we're looking at phase one, go execute on that, and then we'll have some further conversations. And so from that, in the ad hoc work group meetings, that is another good opportunity for y'all to provide feedback to us on potential partial funding. And then that's where we can talk, obviously, not running afoul of any open meetings violations, any walking quorum, anything like that.
Right.
But that's where y'all can provide that feedback to us. And then we can work through that process with y'all. So that's kind of broad strokes on what it looks like. But as y'all are reviewing the applications, looking at project phase, looking at timeline, and finding out if you do fund phase one or phase two of 5 total phases, will they be able to execute on the remainder of the project or some of those near-term goals?
Yeah, because in looking at it, some of these are stretching out over phases in their application to 2029 in some cases, and we don't know what we're gonna have. So that's where partial funding is something that I've thought often as I'm going through the various proposals. Other thoughts, or go ahead, Norman.
I was just gonna say, and unfortunately, we're all faced with making a decision at this point in time with this amount of information that we have, not just about the 150 million, but about what the application speaks to, what they're describing, how they want to achieve a particular proposal. And so while y'all have a vast working knowledge of opportunities out there, because you might see a particular technology or a particular phrase or term of art that you're familiar with, and it might make your mind kind of go in all directions of, I wonder if they're thinking this, and I wonder if they're going to do that, and I wonder if this person is involved as well, et cetera, et cetera. You're evaluating that application as it's been prepared at this point in time for you for an objective evaluation.
Yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts on that?
I mean, it seems like if we are considering, it kind of goes back to the transparency thing. It seems like that we should be baking that into the original proposal input, that we have them propose partial funding at some stage. It may be like an evolution that we have for the next round. Because I'm not sure that we stated it that way, right? And so as somebody, I think if I would like, if there's a thought, I think in the future, if we are opening up partial funding, we should talk about like what would be the best, because this is all about enabling, right? And so making sure that we're enabling in a way that's actually enabling, I think is really, really important. And we should probably bake that into our process. I'd be worried about us arbitrarily enabling or thinking we know what enables without having that discussion and what actually would be helping because all of this is about how do we help them, right? To help us or help Texas, right? And so it seems like we should be thinking about if we want to do partials, we should be baking that into our process.
I guess, without pulling up my computer and getting it online, how did we address that in our current Q and As? Or we're saying that we didn't yet?
It is addressed. Let me pull them up real quick so I don't misquote.
I think two things while he's pulling that up.
Okay.
One, I think to your point, ma'am, yes, it's been addressed as an option that the
Right.
board has
Yes.
from a legal perspective. But I
Right.
think also Kathy's raising the point that perhaps further guidance in the application about phasing out budget requests over multiple years might also be something that we include moving forward as well, if I heard her correctly.
Yeah, I think, I know legally, we've kind of addressed the question, but I think we asked the question after some of the proposals that come in, so I'm not sure everybody's like clearly delineated what would be the different phases. That would be helpful, right?
That's true.
Or partial funding, right?
We allowed the opportunity, but it could have been maybe a little more clear. Certainly not everybody has
Right.
completed that either.
Okay.
So the question in the FAQs, it doesn't specifically talk to partial funding, but the question is there a maximum dollar amount that may be requested? And the answer is no, there is no maximum, and the amount to request is up to each applicant. However, the board is not obligated to fund a grant at the amount requested by the grant. So it contemplates it, but not directly in the context of this.
And as we get into these.
That's in the rules as well.
Right.
And two notes, just they probably go without saying, but that's what I specialize in, is number one, recommending a grant, because they don't have to accept it, right? And I don't want to live, but I'm saying, in the process of saying the board has, you've asked for this much, and it's like what, 3% or whatever it ends up, and they're like, well, we can't do that. Then it's a recommendation, but we'll move on to the next person in the slot. Additionally, on the whole control piece, the grant agreement, let's say that we offer them the amount of money and they accept it. The grant agreement is very robust and it requires their performance on that and to show movement forward. And as callbacks for when they don't, or if they don't succeed. Obviously, we don't want to go the callback route, but there's a lot in there. And so, the grantee can give some input, and then if it won't work for them, then we'll say, come back and apply again later, for a future one. This is what the board offers.
Okay.
And so, there's no duty for them to accept.
That's right. That is a choice. Okay. Other feedback on partial or other
I was
discussion?
thinking kind of on line with what Joseph was saying, but maybe flipping it. I was thinking some of the ones I've looked at had multiple phases, right? And there's some risk that those phase one isn't successful, so 2 and 3 are irrelevant, right? So, and they're over multiple years. It seems like it would be helpful if we could say, you know what, we'll fund phase one, and then we'll talk about phase two if you're successful. But it's kind of the opposite of clawback, right? It's claw forward, if you will. It depends on who has the responsibility for doing the clawing. And so I mean, in my professional job, I do a lot of that. Hey, we'll fund this part, and if it looks promising after that, we'll talk, right? And you could even have we could have a flexibility as a board of, again, funding maybe three projects through phase one with really only enough to go forward with one through subsequent phases, and then we look at it again. So it would be a nice flexibility, I think, for us to have. And I do agree with Kathy. We ought to be in our facts, if we're going to do partial funding, and certainly maybe for bigger ones, we ought to say we recommend partial, that you guys consider partial, partial funding. But I think we ought to advertise that if we're going to consider it. And I guess I'm recommending that we consider it for cases like I was describing.
Very good. Thank you. Okay.
Madam
Couple
Chair,
of-
just to
Go
add
ahead.
one more kind of nuance to what Kirk just said. The National Science Board and the National Science Foundation do a lot of different ways of doing grants, but the way Kirk just described is one of them. The new technology innovation and partnership grants are up to 10 years, but there's actually quarterly reports and annual contract awards. So it's depending on the progress of the work, determines whether it continues. So there are a lot of different ways to do that.
That's good insight. Okay. Different topic, question that came up, should we prioritize any SURF grant awards for proposed projects that have direct impact to military, space, and aerospace activities, such as national defense and homeland security from the space perspective? Very different type of question, but worth talking about.
Madam Chair, if I could just say something there, really two things to keep in mind. One is, do they have the support, express support of a federal entity already, whether it's Homeland Security, NASA, NIST, obviously Space Force, and so forth. So is there already that, and I could see some areas where there might be significant space involvement or torturing of data from space for Homeland Security, as an example, or a space mission that's looking to locate in the state of Texas. So yes, I think that should be a factor. But if people have put in proposals where there's explicit support from a federal entity, I think that gives us leverage for our money. The second area that we should probably think about is, and I know that Norman has had conversations with the military commission. When we anticipate basing decisions in the next 1, 2, 3 years that Texas wants to play, and there are ways for the Space Commission, it seems to me, to make it more likely that those missions locate in Texas. Thinking about what are the specific criteria for selection. Sometimes you know those, sometimes you don't. And what are the barriers so that Texas addressing some of those barriers when a community says there's a space mission and it's a federal mission and there's a basing decision, and the big barrier is military construction or something. So I think being cognizant of those two things, do they have significant federal support for which Texas is kind of a match or an enabler? And second, is there a basing decision upcoming?
Great point. For your experiences, second to none. Other thoughts along that?
You might want to update our Q&A with maybe some of these notes. That way the industry participants can understand our thought process when we start scoring and grading these. That might be beneficial.
I'm going to add the small business side of national security. I think significant federal support doesn't come to startups because of the 4-year budget cycle. And so there's a little bit of there's a misalignment and a mismatch there. But I think if small startups are working towards things on national security, I think that would be a consideration, just to throw a different comment out there.
Okay. All right. My last thread is question. Can the TARSEC Executive Committee meet with any of the ad hoc work groups or subcommittees of the board? How do we engage?
Yeah, so as long as it's a subcommittee, size entity, then yes, they can engage, and they have to be very clear. It has to be very clear they can't do any sharing between subcommittees, or what was shared from the board members.
Right.
Yeah, that's available.
Yeah, because the Space Commission Board of Directors can't create a walking corridor.
Exactly.
So
if you share something with them and they share it with somebody else, right, that's what walking.
we just have to be very, very thoughtful to why and when and how.
Right.
Okay.
So, but as far as instantiating it, it's just calendaring.
Yeah. Of the topics we've talked about today, do we have any go backs? We have hit a lot of ground, and I really appreciate everybody's time. And let me just say, it's really a nice opportunity to sit and visit with us as a full board.
I know on my end, I want to go do more research on small business and indirect cost. I think there's some pieces that we're missing there, or even like not just university indirect cost, but mean, I know the cost of doing business, you know, at Venus Aerospace, like we have to pay air conditioning and we have to pay benefits and we have to cover all of those things. I mean, even while we go test rocket engines. And so I think we might be missing something as a board. And I just want to make sure I need to get smarter. And so I will take that action on our end.
Thanks, Nancy.
I agree, Sassy, and about looking into it. I'll try to, of course, I'm not a small business owner, but I'll go and talk to some of those around and try to pull some info. I also think it's important we do that in a timely fashion, because if we are barred legislatively now from doing that, the next the next couple of months are the right time to go make a change in the legislation. So I think we're kind of on the clock if we want to change it, and we have to change the law. That now is the time to go do that. So the sooner we do that, the better off we are.
So maybe an idea, and again, I don't want to say anything out of turn, but you know, could the commission engage like a Lockheed Martin financial advisor to kind of help understand kind of how to allocate direct costs to include other direct costs and provide some guidance along those lines that then can be shared out to potential grant applicants? There might be some benefit that through the lens of maybe even a small to mid-sized business.
And is there a way that we can utilize TARSEC and some of their public forums to gather that indirect cost information from all the different companies that they're meeting with?
That makes a lot of sense. I don't know if I can't see who's on the call today and if Stephanie is on the line or not, but that's a great suggestion. They have a lot more ability to do that sort of thing. And I believe their next workshop's coming up January 27th, if I recall. And that next workshop will be here in Austin. Can't remember where it is, but I've got that. Okay, great. So, okay. Wow. Good discussion. Thank you all for hanging in there. I feel like we could go the rest of the day talking through these things, but I know that's not a possibility. So with that, I'd like to establish future dates. I know we've looked at 3, but what I'd like to do is with the folks that are here, everybody, it looked like the Friday, January 24th at 9 a.m. Central would enable a forum for our next open meeting. And I wanted to see if those that were a no, if maybe any of those have changed to where you could participate in the Friday, January 24th. And you can certainly get back with Sylvia or Norman with your calendars. But I know that what I hear today is that it's important that we meet frequently for a while. As Kathy stated, as we look to distribute the funds or a percentage of the funds that we have. So this January 24th, right now I have Griffin leaders, Stubbleby, Shannon, Wilson, with 4 not available on that date. Did I have that right?
On the 24th,
Right.
I think the list that you just described were available.
Those are available, right? And then Curry, Gregg, Loomis, Morrison, and Shireman were not available on those dates.
I'm not available on the 24th.
Okay.
My calendar wasn't set to out of office, but I had that I was out. So
I could probably support at 9 a.m. Gwen. So 9 a.m. Central. I'll be in the Mountain Time Zone, and I don't think my commitment there is that early in the morning. I'll verify that, but I think for at least for a couple of hours I could support, and I'll get the exact time and get back to you here in 24 hours.
Not to put everybody on the spot, but what I'd like to do then, Norman, is ask Sylvia to reach back out with the dates. The second meeting date we were looking at was February 10th, which is a Monday. And that one being from 10:30 to 11.
Sorry, 11, yeah, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Start at 11.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And then the third date would be February 28th to start at 11. And I think those are the ones that Sylvia had sent around to us, but we'll follow up. But specifically, the 24th, or others, so we can begin to dig in, as Kathy said. All right, so, I want to just ensure we have a quorum for those dates, or we'll find other dates within that type of time frame to move out. So if there's no further business to attend to, or is there any further business to attend to from any of the board here or staff? Okay, thank you for a couple of solid hours here. Hearing none, meeting is adjourned, and thank you all for being here, and look forward to seeing you again in a few weeks. We will adjourn at 12:05. Thank you all.